Welcome back. In this module, I'm going to introduce you to information architecture. Information architecture is concerned with the way humans cognitively process information. Architecture is needed when users are required to make sense of some information presented to them. When we refer to information architecture in the structure plane, we're talking about the practice of creating structure to the information. When you get into an agency setting or a client setting, you may hear the term information architecture referring to a deliverable, most likely a sitemap that we'll be talking about later. For this context, let's make sure that we're referring to the practice of creating architecture with our information. Information architecture begins with providing structure to content. Essentially, there are two approaches to creating that structure. We either look from the bottom up, from scope requirements, or from the top down, the strategic objectives. To explain that a little further, we can look specifically at how the functional specifications or the content requirements described how the information would be presented or how the features might function. On the opposite end of that, we may want to dial back to strategic objectives and look at user needs. Think about that mental model and that motivation and behavior that we expect from a user. That may change the way we position specific elements of information, either together or apart. Or that may change the way we create hierarchies and labels for those hierarchies, something that we'll talk about a little bit further along in this lecture. Now, you may be asking which one is better and when should I use each? Well, neither is actually better, and most of the time, not sometimes, you need to use both. You can absolutely present things in a way that they're grouped from a features and functionality perspective, or how you expect them to find in other sites. But ultimately, the user needs to guide your choices in how you group things together in an information architecture. And without observing at least part of each one of those practices, it'll be tough to get the ideal state of your information architecture. Going top-down risks missing detail, while bottom-up risks losing sight of the bigger picture, the strategy behind it, what the business wants to accomplish, and what the user wants to get out of the experience. What better way to galvanize our understanding of information architecture than to get you to perform an exercise that will absolutely give you that sense of understanding. Let me introduce you to an exercise we call card sorting. If you go to the URL on your screen right now and scroll down to the blue section, click Launch Demo, then select the first option to each question. Once you get past that survey, you will be in a card sorting exercise software. And I'd like you to group those elements together per the instructions that they give you on the screen. Pause the video, go and do that, and come back and then we'll talk about it a little bit. Now that you're back, I'm sure you've gotten a little more of a clear. Now that you're back, I'm sure things are a little more clear on what information architecture is. Grouping like items together based on user needs, product objectives, features and functionality, or strategic position. How did you solve the card sort? I've seen that exercise performed hundreds of times, and I don't think I've ever seen one the same as anyone else. Now, that may seem a little bit surprising, But the idea of a card sort is if we gather all of the inputs that you've provided, every single person in the class, we will likely have some overlap that will give us a sense of that best experience that we can generate for the majority of people. And that's the idealized state of our information architecture based on inputs from our card sort. When we talk about architecture approaches, the central organizing concept in IA is that node. So those boxes that you dragged around in your browser window in that exercise were called nodes. The reason why we call them nodes is because it's a little bit too premature to say they're going to be pages. They might just be features or functions that live within pages. They may just be conceptual events that happen that live in pages or globally across the entire site. It's a little too early to predict that, but we want to capture all of those nodes so that we don't forget about all of the things that we want to include in our experience, gathered from the information that we have from the strategy plane and the detailed functional specifications and content requirements in the scope plane. We start our information architecture by making a list of all of those elements that we've captured in strategy and scope. A node is simply an empty vessel into which we pour content, features, or functionality. That content type contained by a vessel can be dynamic or it can be static, meaning that it can be continuously the same thing every time that we come back to it. Or if it's a template, it may contain serialized content, so content that is repeated in many places. Also, how we organize this content generally takes one of the following forms. First, hierarchical. In a hierarchy, we have a parent to child relationship, meaning that there are elements grouped together under a specific label. I'm sure you've seen this in many experiences online or anywhere that you go. There are hierarchies, ways of grouping information and labeling them so that you can make sense of them. That tends to be the easiest way to create an information architecture, and 90% of the time, that's the structure that you'll see. The second most used architectural approach is a sequential approach. This is also one that I'm sure you're very familiar with if you think about it. Anytime you go through a step-by-step introduction, learning opportunity, registration, sign up, or even in this case, an online course, you're following a sequential architecture approach where one activity happens and then the next happens sequentially right after it. Online, you'll see that hierarchy and sequential juxtaposition when a user's shopping for a product within a specific category, and then after they decide on the product, they enter into a sequential architecture where they add something to a cart, go to a checkout page, pay for an item, and get a thank you. That's a sequence of events that can't be changed. It's step by step by step. Sure, you can go back and forward, but you can't go up and down or diagonally leave that sequence. The third architecture that I'm going to talk to you about is called a matrix. This one's a little bit more of a departure from hierarchy and sequence, but it's much closer to a hierarchy. A matrix is grouping of information into like categories with labels. But what it also includes is a way to get between those groups, a way to cross the silos of hierarchy that we see. Imagine conceptually we're on a fashion website where we're looking at men's pants of a certain brand. To get to women's pants, we would have to go back up to the top navigation, choose women's, and then choose pants. But if you're looking at a brand of men's pants, and there's a way to navigate from that brand of men's pants to that same brand in the women's wear, that's a matrix architecture approach where there are horizontal ways of breaking across silos. That's probably the easiest way to describe it, but I'm sure you'll probably find different patterns where attributes of specific products allow you to jump across hierarchies. It's more prevalent as well in news or editorial experiences, where an author of an article will be an attribute that allows you to leave that section to go to another section entirely of the website. Or you can navigate by topic or date in a very similar way to cross those hierarchies. If you have any questions about these architecture approaches, don't hesitate to send me a note. Let's talk a little bit more about organizing principles. Nodes in IA are arranged according to organizing principles. We determine which nodes are grouped together and which are kept separate. So those architecture principles that I talked about, where we have groupings of information and labels that create some sense of identity to that group, that's an organizing principle. We need to understand how we group things together in the best way so that our users can find them and understand why they're grouped together as well. That's probably the hardest thing to determine when we create an information architecture strategy for our clients. Organizing principles can be thought of as categories of information. What the categories are, though, depends on the context of the site. For example, in journalism, the categories might be latest or regional. In e-commerce, we typically use the SKU information as organizers. So what is the brand? What is the name of the product? What category does it sit in? What type of product is it? In library or editorial sites, sometimes we look at author and genre to create those categories instead of the title or the type of book it is or the length of it. Think about the attributes of all of these elements of content or products, and you'll see that there could be many ways to slice and dice that information. At the data level, these principles are treated as facets. To explain that a little further, if we think about a book, a product, similar to our exercise last week, each one of those elements used to describe that product is a facet. The author of a book. Author is a facet. The author's name is the attribute. So an example last week with Michelle Obama, author is your facet, Michelle Obama is your attribute. You can group products by a facet like author, so that if you choose the attribute within that facet, you will see all of the results for that facet. So if you choose Michelle Obama as your author, all of the books by that same author will appear. Within facets, we can also have controlled vocabularies. We can have a list of all of the things that we could use to describe that product. A really great example of that is thinking about colors. There's an infinite amount of colors out there. I'm sure we all know that. Imagine as you describe and enter products into your database, you have an open field to write the color name. Fast forward 6 months later, and there are 250 different colors in that field, and no one can find anything on your website. We get around that problem by creating controlled vocabularies. A controlled vocabulary is a list of accepted attributes that can be used in that facet. More about that in just a little as we talk about taxonomy. Home Depot has thousands upon thousands of products. And as a result, it needs a very, very robust taxonomy and hierarchy to its product mix. In this example, we see an expanded menu that has one level of groupings along the left column. And on the interior, we see a heading with 2, 3, and 4 levels of hierarchy within this grouping. Could you find the Halloween decorations from the top level category? And therein lies the difficulty of creating the best information architecture we can. It's not always obvious where a specific element will live in a hierarchy. When hierarchy ends, facets take over. You can't have every facet of a product live within a hierarchy. For example, some of the things we see here, like brand, special offer, price, feature, those are the types of things that don't necessarily work as well in a hierarchical approach. And we lean on these facets of products and services to allow us to segment our product once we hit the end of our hierarchy. Where hierarchy ends, faceted navigation begins. And the most accepted convention for faceted navigation are what we see here, filters. Filtering is just a common word for describing a segmentation of a specific grouping of products or services. Effectively, we are choosing a specific attribute within a facet, and we're only showing those elements to our user. That allows the user to see specific products with the feature that they're looking for. So that was an introduction to information architecture. In the next module, we'll dig even deeper and talk about taxonomy and metadata. We'll see you in the next module.